Obama immediately informed Israel that it doesn't apply to them, so they can forget about it. At the same time, the Security Council passed a resolution which got plenty of publicity. It was described as aimed at Iran, so it was good. It called on all states to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to settle their disagreements within the framework of the UN Charter and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, meaning by peaceful means. Well, those provisions were directed against the United States. There's only 2 countries in the world that are threatening the use of force, which is also criminal. Take a look at the UN Charter, which bars the threat or use of force in international affairs. But across the spectrum in the United States, the threat of force is considered legitimate, and often the use of force. So yes, it's a criminal state across the spectrum. And so the US and Israel are the only countries that are threatening the use of force, and in fact preparing for it. So whether they'll do it, who knows. But without report here, the United States has recently sent to the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, has sent submarine tenders to care for nuclear submarines. The nuclear submarines are undetectable and they can carry nuclear weapons. And it has also sent to Diego Garcia the biggest bombs in the US arsenal, short of nuclear weapons, what are called massive ordnance penetrators, bunker busters they're called. They're aimed specifically at Iran, nobody else. There's a huge 13-ton bombs, which are supposed to be able to penetrate deep into the earth through, thousands of tons of reinforced concrete. It doesn't get reported here, but of course it's known to Iranian intelligence, and it's supposed to be. It's a threat of force. Actually, the Diego Garcia is an island which isn't talked about much, but it's crucial to U.S. International aggression. It's the major base for the bombing of the Middle East and Central Asia and so on. It's actually was a British island. The British expelled the population on orders of the master. They appealed to be returned and won in British courts, but as Diane said, law doesn't matter if the master says no, so they can't return. Diego Garcia is part of Africa. The African Union, just a couple of months ago, established a nuclear weapons-free zone. If anybody were really interested in stopping limiting nuclear proliferation, what they'd be doing is supporting nuclear weapons-free zones around the world. Well, Africa finally had one, but they can't implement it because of Diego Garcia. The United States and Britain, loyally trailing behind, refused to allow the nuclear-free treaty to apply to Diego Garcia because they intend to use it. They do use it for storing nuclear weapons and might use it for attacking the outliers. That's incidentally not the only case. There's also a South Pacific nuclear weapons-free zone, which also isn't implemented because the U.S. insists on excluding the Pacific Islands, which are used for bases where the U.S. stores nuclear weapons, nuclear submarines, and so on. So that's not implemented. Come back to another important nuclear weapons-free zone in a moment. Anyway, the outlier is Iran. Now, actually, there are 3 countries that have not ever signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, nuclear states: Israel, India, and Pakistan. All developed nuclear weapons with U.S. support and are still doing so. Pakistan, it's one of Ronald Reagan's gifts to the world. India, it's accelerated in the last couple of years. Under Bush, there was a U.S.-Indian treaty signed, which is in direct violation of all the international conventions on non-proliferation. It permits India to develop nuclear weapons in secret, and it permits the U.S. to help them by providing them with nuclear technology. Now, the story is it's for civilian use, but everybody knows that the boundary between civilian use and military application is quite small. And furthermore, even providing it for civilian use permits India to divert its technology and research to nuclear weapons, as in fact it's doing quite openly. So immediately after the Security Council resolution I mentioned, India announced, though it wasn't reported here, that it can produce nuclear weapons with the same yield as the superpowers, the US and Russia. Obama quietly informed India that the Security Council resolution doesn't apply to them. Pakistan responds to India, so they're openly, in fact, developing new nuclear weapons facilities, uranium enrichment, and so on. Those are the real threats of nuclear weapons in the region. The three countries that refused to sign the treaty and that are backed by the US when they openly defy the Security Council, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and so on. Not the outlier may be a problem, but that's a US issue. The US is not supported by the world on this, contrary to what you read. So the call for sanctions, what you read is Iran is defying the international community. The international community is a term that has a rather technical meaning. It refers to Washington and whoever happens to agree with it at the moment. So the international community excludes the majority of states in the world, the former non-aligned movement, which vigorously support Iran's right to develop nuclear power, as permitted under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, everyone agrees. It excludes China and Russia, it excludes India, which is opposed to sanctions, excludes Brazil, which is pointedly opposed to sanctions, Turkey, the one major Middle East power, doesn't want sanctions. In fact, even the Arab League, which the US is supposedly catering to, they just had a meeting and declared their opposition to sanctions, call for diplomacy. But nevertheless, the international community steadfastly insists on higher sanctions. Incidentally, the American people aren't part of the international community. I haven't seen a recent poll. Opinion may have changed after all the propaganda the last couple of years. But in 2007, a considerable majority of Americans agreed with the world outside the international community. That is, agreed that Iran has a right, same right as everyone else, to develop nuclear energy. Well, they're the outliers. There was a meeting in Tehran of 60 states a couple of days ago. It's very hard to find out who was there because nothing's covered. But there was a meeting, and they came out with a declaration calling for an end to any nuclear weapons, and they called for establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Now, that's an interesting proposal. In this case, the US population is overwhelmingly in support of it, and so is just everyone in the world who's polled, at least. Very strong support for a nuclear weapons-free zone that would mitigate and maybe terminate whatever the alleged threats are of Iran developing a nuclear weapons capability. They just called for it in the Tehran meeting. I don't think it was reported here. There are two countries that have a particularly deep commitment to this, namely the United States and Britain. The reason is because when the US and Britain invaded Iraq, they tried to provide a kind of a thin legal cover for it, and the way they did it was by appealing to a Security Council resolution, Resolution 687 in 1991, which called on Iraq to dismantle its weapons of mass destruction. And the US and Britain claimed they hadn't done it. We know that was false, but that was the claim. And that justified their invasion of Iraq. Well, if you bother reading that resolution, you'll see that it commits the signers to establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. So the US and Britain, over and above all others, have a commitment to this. And if there was a real interest in non-proliferation instead of just rhetorical, that's what would be pursued. Well, going back to Israel, which is not the only beneficiary of US criminality, India and Pakistan are too. But in the case of Israel, they're immune from the International Atomic Energy Agency, Security Council, and in fact, a long record of US vetoes of Security Council resolutions that